The war is over. Almost with British punctuality. 2 years and 1 day after the massacre carried out by Hamas in Israel on October 7th, 2023, Israel, Hamas, the Arab countries, and Donald Trump, all of them have reached a historic agreement to end the war in Gaza. Israel and Hamas have signed in Cairo the implementation of the first phase of the peace plan. We're talking about what could become Donald Trump's greatest achievement in international politics across his 2 presidential terms, because this agreement opens the door for peace and for the military eradication of Hamas to finally reach Gaza. But then, can it really work? Well, in this video, we're going to tell you all the details about this agreement, the fine print, the risks, everything you need to know to understand what's happening. But first, let's remember how and when it all began. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas, together with Islamic Jihad and several other radical Palestinian groups, launched what they called the Al-Aqsa Flood Operation, a brutal and surprise attack against several Israeli kibbutzim and a peace music festival being held near the Gaza-Israel border. The plan to maximize civilian deaths. The result? 1,195 Israelis massacred, more than 250 hostages captured, and a brutal shock to Israeli society, which was left completely stunned. This was, in fact, the deadliest attack Israel had ever suffered in its entire history. As Joe Biden himself described it, it was the worst massacre of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. The question is, what on earth was going through the minds of the Hamas leaders and their allies when they decided to commit such an atrocity? Well, basically, at that time, the leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, had 2 major objectives in mind. First, to derail the possible peace and normalization agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. The deal seemed imminent and would have been a severe blow to Hamas's interests. Because, of course, if Israelis and Saudis were to shake hands, that would mean the definitive end of Israel's exceptional status. Its commercial, political, and financial ties with the Arab world would skyrocket. And with that, Hamas and other Palestinian groups would lose much of their influence. That was the first goal, a brutal action to blow up a deal that seemed just around the corner. The second objective was deeper. Hamas hoped that the attack would trigger a massive campaign by Israel led by Hezbollah, Syria, Iran, and even the Shiite militias in Iraq. The idea that this large-scale offensive would corner Israel and force it to give in, while Hamas would emerge strengthened by a great victory. But the terrorist group badly miscalculated its strength. Very badly. With society completely in shock, the Israeli government launched a brutal punitive operation with one goal: to wipe out Hamas entirely.
עברנו להתקפה. כל איש חמאס הוא בן מוות. חמאס זה דאעש, ונרסק ונחסל אותו, כפי שהעולם ריסק וחיסל את דאעש.
And that was only the beginning. The war soon spread, though not in the way Hamas leaders had imagined. Over these 2 years, we've witnessed unprecedented destruction throughout the Gaza Strip, the annihilation of most of Hamas's military capabilities, and also those of Hezbollah in Lebanon. We've seen the fall of the al-Assad regime in Syria, a series of punitive strikes against the Houthis in Yemen, and, as you may recall, a massive 12-day Israeli bombing campaign targeting all sorts of strategic and military sites in Iran, to the point that Iran's powerful Revolutionary Guard was decapitated. Even in the West Bank, pressure and punitive operations have multiplied, and nearly 100,000 work visas were cancelled. VisualPolitik community, Israel's response to October 7th has exceeded all expectations. A strong response was expected, but what we've witnessed has gone far beyond that. During this time, nearly 2,000 Israelis and more than 67,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza's Ministry of Health, which is controlled by Hamas, have lost their lives. Moreover, over 2 million people have been displaced, and most of the Gaza Strip has been devastated and reduced to rubble. By the way, of the 255 hostages taken by Hamas, 148 were returned alive, and the bodies of 59 murdered hostages were recovered. Of the 48 still held by Hamas, it's estimated that 20 are still alive. And now, all of them, both the living and the dead, must be returned so they can finally go home. Because that is the first condition of a peace agreement born with a goal as ambitious as it is complicated: to end the war and allow Gaza to have a future without Hamas. The question is, what does the agreement actually include? Here at VisualPolitik, we've already talked about Trump's plan, but what exactly has been signed? What concessions has Israel made? What will happen to Hamas? And above all, the most important question of all, can it really succeed? Well, stay tuned.
the deal of the century.
The agreement reached in Egypt between Israel and Hamas is not the final piece, and this is very important to understand, because it will determine what happens in the coming days and weeks. What has been agreed upon is only the initial phase of what could eventually lead to peace. So what exactly are we talking about here? What has been agreed upon, and what can we expect from now on? Well, you see, the most important element in this first phase is the release of all Israeli hostages still being held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip. As we've already mentioned, according to Israel, there are 48 people, of whom 20 are believed to still be alive. The plan sets out that all living hostages will be released between Saturday, October 11th and Monday, October 13th, while the bodies of those killed could begin to be returned over the following 10 days. That's on Hamas's side, because Israel, for its part, has also made major concessions. In this case, Netanyahu has agreed to release about 1,700 Palestinian detainees. Of these, 250 are prisoners currently held in Israel's maximum security facilities, and Hamas is demanding the release of certain individuals, in particular, especially these two, Marwan Barghouti and Ahmad Sadat. The question is, who on earth are these guys, and why are they so important? Well, Barghouti is a prominent member of Fatah, the organization that governs the Palestinian National Authority, which still controls the West Bank. He was sentenced to 5 life terms for planning attacks that killed 5 Israelis. He's also considered one of the leaders of both intifadas, the one in 1987 and the one in the early 2000s. For those who may not know, the intifadas were 2 violent uprisings against Israel that took place in both the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, resulting in thousands of deaths. And then there's the other prisoner, reportedly on the list, Ahmad Sadat, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, another Palestinian armed group. He's been convicted of terrorism and for orchestrating several attacks, including one that killed an Israeli minister in 2001. In short, we're talking about 2 heavyweights, 2 major terrorists who could be walking free within just a few hours. And you know what that means. That the release of hostages is not unconditional, it's part of a prisoner exchange deal, as has happened before, though this time the names involved are much more significant. Then there's another key issue, the withdrawal of Israeli troops. Well, it seems there won't be any surprises here, and Trump's plan will be followed more or less to the letter. At least for now. That plan envisions a gradual, phased withdrawal of the IDF from Gaza, depending on how the implementation of the peace process progresses. And that means that once all the hostages have been released, the IDF will pull back toward the border, leaving free roughly all the yellow area you're seeing on screen. This is a line that's still hand-drawn, meaning no exact coordinates have been set yet for where Israeli forces will be positioned. But what matters is that it implies a withdrawal from about 70% of the Gaza Strip. In fact, the Israeli army has already announced that preparations for this withdrawal have begun. Take a look.
The IDF has begun operational preparations ahead of the implementation of the agreement. As part of this process, preparations and a combat protocol are underway to transition to adjusted deployment lines soon.
And finally, this agreement also includes the reopening of the Rafah crossing. In this case, we're talking about the main border crossing between Egypt and Gaza, an enclave that is controlled, and will continue to be controlled, by Israel, but which will reopen once the ceasefire takes effect. And pay attention because this is key. It will allow not only the entry of massive amounts of goods and international aid, but also the movement of Palestinians in and out of Gaza. Of course, all of this will happen under extremely tight and thorough controls by Israeli forces. Now then, do you know what's most interesting about all this? It's that the plan now no longer involves only Hamas on the Palestinian side. It also includes the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. These groups don't get talked about as much, but they're the other 2 major organizations operating in this part of Palestine, and until now they had stayed out of all these negotiations. Islamic Jihad even said outright that they didn't recognize Trump's plan at all, and that it had nothing to do with them. However, things have turned out a bit differently. Take a look.
Representatives from 2 other Palestinian armed groups, Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, were also present at talks. Their involvement appeared to be an attempt by Hamas to keep them in line and secure the release of the hostages they are believed to be holding.
It turns out that not all the hostages are in Hamas's hands. Some are reportedly being held by these other groups, and that's why it was absolutely essential for them to be also included in the agreement reached in Egypt. Now then, all of this we're telling you, while it's great news and marks the beginning of a possible lasting peace, it's not without its shadows. Gaza lies in ruins. The distrust between both sides is absolute, and almost no one feels confident about what comes next, about what will happen after Israel gets all of its hostages back. Qatar, and especially Turkey, which got involved at the last minute, have played a key role in convincing Hamas to trust Trump's guarantees. Those guarantees, by the way, are based on the promise that Israel will not resume the war once it recovers its people. But of course, given what we've seen over the past few months, the risk is extremely high. And I must stress this again, this agreement is not a final peace deal. To achieve peace, there are still many obstacles to overcome, and the biggest one will be getting Hamas to agree to give up power in Gaza and fully disarm. In fact, this is one of the major sticking points, because the Palestinian group is still refusing to hand over control of Gaza to a transitional international authority.
After the release of the statement, the plan, a senior Hamas official said outright that Hamas rejected the Board of Peace. We will never accept anyone who is not Palestinian to control the Palestinians.
In short, things are only just beginning, and while all this is a ray of hope, achieving peace could still come with a lot of sweat and tears. That's why, you know what? I think it's worth taking a closer look at all the possible dark sides surrounding this agreement. Stay tuned.
The ghosts of the agreement.
VisualPolitik community, the level of destruction in the Gaza Strip is beyond words. According to United Nations estimates, the majority of homes, over 90%, have been damaged or completely reduced to rubble. The Israeli intervention to rescue the hostages and annihilate Hamas has been an absolute steamroller. The aerial images leave no room for doubt. And yes, Gaza City has taken the worst hit. We're talking about the great Palestinian metropolis, one of the oldest cities in the world, with a history stretching back thousands of years, even mentioned in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament, now reduced to dust. What was once a vital port and a key urban center for the Assyrians, Babylonians, Greeks, Persians, Hasmoneans, Romans, and Ottomans is now little more than ruins. If this was once the birthplace of the first institutions of the Palestinian National Authority, today it has, at least for many decades, buried the dream of a Palestinian state. And all because Hamas turned it into its own personal kingdom of terror. From here, from Gaza of Hashim, as the city is also known, in honor of the Prophet Muhammad's great-grandfather, who is buried here, this terrorist group planned its operations against Israel. From here, they systematically launched countless rockets against the Jewish state for years, and of course, something that's often forgotten, from here, they also ran a massive campaign of repression against their own people. At least against those who dared to speak out against their authoritarian and radical government. Because, let's be clear, this is rarely mentioned. But Gaza was no democracy, not even close. No, Hamas ruled this territory with an iron fist. Just look at the past 2 years of war. The number of dissidents killed by the Arrow Unit, something like Hamas's political police, its repressive arm, has skyrocketed. And of course, the torture hasn't stopped either. For example, just a few weeks ago, Hamas militants tortured Ahmed al-Masri, a well-known local journalist. Reportedly, they broke his feet and shot him in the legs. His crime? Protesting against Hamas's control and policies. Another recent case, activist Uday al-Rubai stabbed and thrown off a tower as a warning to other Palestinians. You see, be careful who you rebel against. And that is exactly what Hamas is, a fundamentalist terrorist group, something we sometimes tend to forget. Of course, this also means that hundreds of thousands of Gazans are nothing more than prisoners of this organization, something Netanyahu's government completely ignored, to the point of carrying out a level of destruction that is utterly unacceptable. But well, now all of that is history. Gaza will have a new government, a provisional authority tasked with restoring order and rebuilding the territory, while Israel must take a step back. That's the deal. But signing it is one thing, and actually fulfilling it is quite another. Because we're talking about Gaza and Israel, and there's a lot that can still go wrong.
I feel that this agreement might collapse in the upcoming stages. I'm not very optimistic. I'm worried, said Ahmed Humaid, 35 years old, in the Gaza city of Nuseirat.
Specifically, we can point to 3 major obstacles that could derail this entire process. First, the agreement states that several Muslim countries will send troops. But of course, it's not that simple. Everything has to be organized. Logistics, deployment rules, coordination between different forces, and most importantly, these countries have to really take it seriously. If they don't, if they're not willing to impose order, no matter the cost, and go after all kinds of radical groups, then their inaction could end up derailing the entire agreement. But here's the dilemma. Using a heavy hand could expose them to retaliation from Gaza's radical factions, and they could also be accused of collaborating with Israel. That could create a lot of political trouble back home. In other words, it's far from clear that they have the right incentives to carry out this mission effectively. Qatar, Egypt, Turkey. All the Muslim countries involved in the negotiations have pressured Hamas to accept its dissolution as a paramilitary force and to relinquish power. For now, they seem to have agreed, but there's a problem. Hamas could fracture from within. Over the past 2 years, Israel has destroyed most of the group's capabilities and exerted immense pressure on them, to the point that news like this one have understandably stopped making headlines.
Depleted Hamas is so low on cash that it can't pay its fighters.
The result of all the Israeli pressure? Well, Hamas has been forced to bring in many new recruits, less trained, but far more radicalized, and above all, with very little sense of loyalty to the clan. This has caused the terrorist organization to operate in an increasingly fragmented way. In other words, through units that tend to act independently, making their own decisions about when and how to attack Israelis. These are relatively new groups, loosely connected to Hamas's central hierarchy. And what's the problem with that? Well, many of them may refuse to accept the agreement, or may already be planning to blow it up in the future once they've regained strength. If that happens, this entire plan would hang by a thread, because the question is, will the international troops deployed there really be willing to confront these groups head on? That's far from certain. Finally, we can't forget that right now, Gaza is a completely devastated territory with more than 2 million people crammed into tents or living among ruins. There's a shortage of everything, and if things aren't handled properly, that could lead to massive frustration. And a flood of money is going to pour into Gaza. But we'll have to see whether the new provisional authority is really able to take the bull by the horns. If there's one thing the experience of the US administration in Iraq taught us after the invasion, it's that this is never simple. And if they fail to take the bull by the horns, things could spiral out of control. So, these are the 3 major obstacles that must be overcome for the agreement to succeed. That said, there's also some good news. The withdrawal and the disconnection from Israel may lead many Palestinians to see this new chapter as a genuine opportunity to start from scratch. In fact, there are parts of Gaza that haven't been under Hamas control for months, and things have already started to improve there. But of course, beyond Gaza, for all this to truly work, there's another country that must be fully committed to making peace succeed this time. And of course, I'm talking about Israel.
What about Israel?
VisualPolitik community, let's be clear. Israel's political situation is another major factor that will determine whether the ceasefire agreement actually turns into lasting peace or not. And the truth is, the division within the government is total. Remember that Netanyahu's current government is a rather odd mix between the Prime Minister's Likud party and 2 much more radical factions, the Religious Zionism Party and the ultra-Orthodox Jewish Power Party. Well, none of the cabinet members from those 2 parties even want to hear about ending the war. They want the total destruction of Hamas, no matter the cost. And precisely because of that, the first cracks in the coalition didn't take long to appear. In fact, we've already seen statements from Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich saying things like this.
We cannot join in the short-sighted celebrations or vote in favor of the deal. It is a huge responsibility to ensure that this is not, God forbid, a deal of hostages in exchange for stopping the war, as Hamas thinks and brags about. Israel should continue to strive with all its might for the real eradication of Hamas and the real demilitarization of Gaza so that it no longer poses a threat to Israel.
Of course, with this agreement, Netanyahu has put his coalition partners between a rock and a hard place. Because you know what? If there's one thing Israeli society overwhelmingly wants, it's the return of the hostages hostages and an end to the war. Bibi's partners can vote against the agreement, which, by the way, doesn't actually threaten its approval, but even so, this time they can't play too hard. After 2 years of conflict, the polls are crystal clear. In this September poll, 2/3 of Israelis said it's time to end the war, 13 points higher than a year ago. And according to that same survey, nearly 2/3 of Jewish Israelis and 8 out of 10 Arab Israelis believe that the main goal of the war should be to bring the hostages home. So if this agreement achieves that, for the vast majority of the Israeli population, the war that Netanyahu's coalition partners want to continue would no longer be justified. And remember, these figures come from before the hostage release agreement was announced. If the poll were conducted again today, I'm sure the results would be even more decisive, overwhelmingly in favor of ending military operations once and for all. VisualPolitik community, after the announcement of the agreement, we've seen people taking to the streets to celebrate, spontaneous dances, and even proposals to rename stadiums after Trump.
Kiryat Bialik, home to hostage Matan Angrist, announces plan to name new soccer field after Trump.
The reality is undeniable. Trump's plan is hugely popular in Israel. After all, remember that many lives have already been lost. More than 1,150 Israeli soldiers have died over these 2 years of conflict, most of them very young. And then there's the cost of maintaining mobilization and recruitment. Disrupted lives, personal projects put on hold, and countless companies struggling with staff shortages whenever one of their employees is called to the front. This war has become undesirable for everyone, or almost everyone, and that, perhaps, is the greatest hope for peace. You've seen it. The release of the hostages could bring Gaza and Israel much closer to peace, and of course, we truly hope that happens, and that everyone, without exception, fulfills their part. Only time will tell whether this plan will finally change, and for the better. Not only the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, but even the broader regional stability in the Middle East. Without a doubt, here at VisualPolitik, we'll be following it very closely. But for now, it's your turn. Do you think the war in Gaza is about to end? Or will Netanyahu take the gamble of defying Trump and continue attacking Hamas after getting the hostages back? Are we witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in the Middle East? Share your thoughts down below in the comments and let's see what you think. And before you go, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik so you don't miss any future episodes of this story or many others yet to come. As always, thank you so very much for your support. Take care. I'll see you next time.